Wheel City. Self-care Sunday. Yo. I'm like self-care on Sundays with a day off on Monday. Private jet on the runway, taking off, going one way to the top. Whoa. Who said the sky is the limit when I'm high is my vision? On Facebook Live, going live in a minute. Don't mind me, I'm just minding my business. Breaking news, doing interviews, but it's not about me, I'm doing this for you. Matter of fact, no, I'm doing this for proof that a self-care Sundays and dreams come true. They really do.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into today's episode of Self-Care Sundays. We're back with Carla Gaskins-Nathan, who we spoke to back in season 1 for what we're calling a self-care homecoming. For our new listeners this season, Carla is a massage therapist and founder of Rooted Bodywork Massage Services in New York. Before we get started with Carla, I wanted to ask for your help supporting the podcast via Patreon. Patreon allows supporters of the show to donate a monthly amount to help with our costs, including monthly maintenance fees and to pay our audio engineer. We'd also like to raise enough money to hire a transcription service to make our episodes more accessible to everyone. If you'd like to help us out, please check out patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. That's patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. Thank you in advance. It's the generosity of our listeners that helps this information be accessible to so many people in the first place. Let's get started. How are you today, Carla?
I'm well. Thanks for asking.
So since a lot of this episode is going to be kind of somewhat retrospective and we have this cool arc of tying to season 1, can you update listeners on where you are in your self-care journey now in June 2018 as opposed to August 2017 when we recorded for season 1?
Yeah. For my personal journey, definitely have been embracing my ancestors more since our last call. Built a bigger altar for myself personally, and then I have a separate one that's for my ancestors, and have really just been reaching out to more friends and talking about my practices personally, and then also reaching out and have seemed to be, I think also at the same time, then through that attracting people who are also in that same process, and particularly a lot of women of color that are really trying to find the balance of embracing what we believe are our ancestral spiritual practices and healing as well. And so it just kind of seems to come full circle, and which is a big part of why when we talked about, hey, season 2, this was something that really had been on my mind that I'd been thinking about in terms of a self-care homecoming.
Yeah, something that framed our discussion last season was your expertise with Eastern medicine, and you noted that a lot of these quote-unquote new treatments for well-being aren't in fact new. You said they're our stuff, referring to women of color, Black and brown people who may have lost touch with these practices through generations of colonization and gentrification. How does that frame inform your practice at Rooted Bodywork?
That frame really informs my practice both as a massage therapist, and then another big piece of my work at Rooted Bodywork is also doing wellness consulting. And with that right now, I'm doing a lot of work with Auburn Seminary as the Embodied Justice Leadership Resident with them here in Manhattan. And so right now I'm really just thinking about, as a facilitator, looking at how I believe that the body knows what it needs, but just sometimes people need some help quieting the things that are going on so that they can hear themselves and what the body needs better. And really just approaching our work, not just in the massage therapy context, but as we talk about self-care and wellness, about us not needing to be fixed and not being broken, and instead about facilitating conversations between clients and their bodies. And then in terms of holding space as a facilitator, really looking at listening and creating space for people so that they can listen to themselves and listen to the offerings that are being had, and then offering tools and resources so that people are able to really explore what they need. Because sometimes we come to something thinking we need one thing, and then once we get there, something shifts and you're like, oh, I thought I was just coming to this workshop for this piece. I just wanted to learn something about essential oils. And it turns out your body's like, nope, we need to talk about sleep. So really talking about the nourishment and the relaxation and the healing, and also just connecting to our truth in particular, has been a big piece in the work in the last year.
Yeah, as you're talking, it's making me think about the idea of kind of reclaiming practices as you're talking about tools and practices. And we talked about this idea of reclaiming in the context of language, cultural appropriation, representation, and who kind of gets to do certain things. And I'm wondering, how do you think about that? And like, if I were to ask you, I'm an Indian woman, how do I reclaim yoga when yoga has now become kind of understood to be something that bougie white women in Brooklyn do?
Yeah. Well, first I'd like to start from the place of just sharing when I really was meditating on what does it mean for coming home to self-care and to yourself. And so really thinking about embracing our ancestral, spiritual, and healing practices and believing that that's a path to home within ourselves, to our own wellness, but bigger than that, then to our liberation. And I think that as people of color, then it especially helps us see ourselves, but also helps us see each other in a different way and not through a white supremacist narrative lens or frame.
Yeah.
And so as an Indian woman that's reclaiming yoga, for example, is just the big piece of that is just knowing that history. So if you were someone that was raised with knowing that, I was having a conversation with my wife and had a really long conversation about, for some of us, depending on, if we were born here in the United States, if, our parents were taught certain practices and things were taught down, some of us are piecemealing. And if we're somebody that's having to kind of backtrack and get that, it wasn't something that we were brought up with and raised, we're coming at this in the best way that we can. And so, realizing as folks of color that we can't culturally appropriate, I believe, on our own cultures. And so I think sometimes a lot of us have some shame around that. It doesn't mean that as we do this work, though, that things may not be awkward or messy. So my wife used the example of, African garb and how, you could be like, I'm really drawn to this pattern, show up to a house party, and you're in what's a pattern that's usually a print that's used for funeral garb, and not know it. It's not coming out of a place of disrespect, but it's coming out of a place of I'm just trying to connect to what I know is my roots, but I don't have a map of how to get there. And so I would say the same thing in your case is that if you don't necessarily have the map to get there, but you know the recipe that you want to make, your recipe might look a little different than others. But knowing that work and that practice is yours, it's in your DNA, and approaching it in a way that works for you. So does that mean seeking out a teacher of color or a studio that has more people of color in it so that you feel like you're being nourished in the proper way as you approach the work and the practice?
Yeah. As I started doing yoga recently, this was not an accidental example. I realized my yoga teacher is from East Asia, and I realized I really don't think I'd be comfortable taking yoga and having it taught by a white person because I would just feel like you stole this shit from me. It would just not be a relaxing experience.
And then the piece around coming home is really about that instance of returning home and what the home is for you, and realizing that the benefits of it for us as people of color is, awakening, clarity. And for a lot of people really just talk about things really just falling into place. And so I think the work needs to be approached, or one of the values that I have in approaching this work is really just recognizing it through decolonizing our ideas and letting go of beliefs that don't serve us. And so that's one of the first steps in doing this, is being like, there's certain things because of white supremacy, because of the history of this country, that we have ideas in ourselves as people of color and internalized oppression that we're going to have to let go of, and we're going to have to re-examine how we approach and look at things, and letting go of beliefs that don't serve us. Some of us have beliefs or misbeliefs about our own cultural practices that don't serve us, and then it sets a barrier up for us to even embrace what our people had been using for generation after generation after generation. And so first, just how do we make our own practices accessible to ourselves emotionally, in addition to the fact that we have to do, for some of us, we have to do some digging, we have to do some research, or we have to seek out, teachers in order to learn some of these practices.
I love what you're saying, because it's kind of multifold. You're talking about that there's a learning we have to do to understand kind of where do we come from, what is native to us, what is ours. And as you're saying, some of that is piecing that together if it's not something that's been passed down. But there's also this component that I find really interesting, which is about you're saying, being kind to yourself through that journey, but this other piece of the unlearning that allows you to do that learning, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. And that unlearning, for example, it's kind of when I was writing things out of thinking about, what are kind of the problems or potential issues or pitfalls that we may have in doing this work. And I think commonly I hear people say, that they're really fighting with, believing that they're not enough, that they're broken or that they're damaged. And recognizing that that's a product of the ills and isms of our environment, of the society. And also recognizing that it's reinforced by frequent white capitalistic exclusionist just frame that's used to market self-care. So the thing that can be really hard is that while people are starting to kind of dip their toe in the water of like, okay, I'm ready to do some of the self-care, when they start, like you said, looking up things like yoga teachers and some things, what might come up first is something that does not reflect them or who they are or who they're what they value. And so you already are coming out of a place of trying to work through guilt and shame, and it's an ongoing process. Then as soon as you're ready to kind of dip your toe in, you're bombarded with things that reinforce those negative beliefs. And so that's a huge thing that we have to just kind of continually work on. I mean, for example, even just in doing this work, you Google wellness, you Google yoga. Sometimes it's hard to, even in the beginning, when you look at image search, seeing people of color doing these practices that are ours.
Yes.
How do we get more visuals and things out there? But also recognizing that the wellness industry, the spa industry is huge. It's estimated that about $3.7 trillion has been spent globally on the wellness industry, and that it's an industry. So one of the solutions to that, I believe, is us rewriting our own narratives. And so recognizing, and I'm going to say white supremacy a lot today because it's stuff that I've been working on and the work that I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
But really just recognizing that it requires that our wellness work is self-preservation. So our wellness work isn't just spas and pedicures, but for us as people of color, it's self-preservation, it's protection, it's self-discovery, and I think most importantly, self-love, because we are living in a society that we are not seeing love of Black and brown bodies reflected. And so the society, unfortunately, is really okay with devaluing our Black and brown bodies. And capitalism then benefits from it when that isn't valued. So we just have to interrupt that through the decolonization. And I really believe embracing our ancestral, spiritual, and healing practices. And that consciously we just have to work on our minds first for that, and then from there embrace the various practices. And that there's so many, people being called to take a drumming class, to wanting to start doing Tai Chi or Reiki, or, embracing Ayurvedic traditions.
Yeah, it's so interesting, everything, this idea of kind of like that there's so much, but then we're just not represented in stuff that we created and that is originated with us. It's actually a reason I was thinking about like changing our podcast art for the show to make it like just more specifically clear that like I am a brown woman doing self-care. And I was like thinking through what that could look like.
Yeah, like what would that look like?
Because I was like, I think that imagery is just important. I was like, could I get someone to like draw or even like take a picture of me as an Indian American person in a yoga pose?
Yes.
And I was thinking like through like that imagery would just be really powerful.
I think that'd be huge. And then it also helps distinguish this podcast, because we know that there are, others that are not, focusing or maybe as inclusive of people of color, and particularly women of color, which we know we definitely need. We need more of that. We need more visuals.
Yeah, and I think especially this idea, like here, we're not trying to sell anybody anything. Like we ask people to support this space, but we're often talking and deconstructing privilege and challenges people have in accessing self-care, as opposed to being like, here is the $9,000 silver bullet that will solve all your problems.
All the problems.
All the problems, everyone.
Yeah.
Fix your husband too.
Yeah. All the things. All the things.
All the things, yeah. So I'd love to learn more, as we're talking about this idea of exploration and finding these practices. In your experience, how do people who maybe haven't learned specific practices from relatives, ancestors, how do they go about that journey of discovering them, finding teachers to revive and connect with those more, quote unquote, traditional practices?
I think one of the things that's helpful for a lot of people is making time for quiet. I feel like often when I speak with folks that are further along in the process, where they are embracing some of the spiritual practices and healing practices, especially for folks that weren't raised with that, but have had to rediscover, relearn it, has been having time for stillness and contemplation. So be it if it's formal meditation or just things like, I got in a habit where it's like, oh, I'm walking the dog, so I'm going to have an earbud in and have music on. So like Do you always need to be listening to your headphones when you're on a train? Like taking those moments and times to just have quiet. Now I live in New York, so it's always a bit loud. But even if there's the background noise, it's still different from me constantly having media or things coming at me. And I will notice in those times of deciding, you know what, I'm ready to work today. I'm not going to listen to music. I'm not going to listen to a podcast right now. I'm not going to listen, to some other show, or you see people watching Netflix on the train, whatever. I'm just going to be quiet. And I find often when that happens, things come up that you are like, hey, I haven't ever thought about doing this particular practice. Or, I feel like I want to take a drumming class. I feel like I want to explore energy work. A lot of it, I feel like, is intuitive and will start to come up. The other route, of course, is if you do know your, ethnic, cultural background, then you can just start looking stuff up. You can just start looking things up on the internet, reading books, and just seeing what interests you, and then just start practicing. Certain things, especially around spirituality, can be self-guided and done alone. It is not like you have to go and pay to go somewhere to do in terms of certain healing practices. Same thing for certain types of energy work, that there's some things you can start doing on your own. And then from there, if you feel like you have interest beyond what the books can answer, then you can seek out, teachers. And again, on the internet, Facebook and things like that have been a space where a lot of folks of color are building communities specifically around that. So like on Instagram and Facebook, I follow Hood Witch. There's there's different Black and POC groups that exist online. And you can also, even if you're not ready to share, most of them, once you join, and they might ask a couple questions because they don't want to be infiltrated by people who are not of color or not there for the right purposes. They don't want people marketing. You can just hang out and kind of see what are the questions, what are the dialogues that people are having with one another. People share resources in terms of books. Where do you buy herbs if you're into crystals? All those different things to kind of get you started.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's like the way to start is just start. Right? That's kind of what you're saying, that there's no magical formula. You start looking, you start researching. And I really love the idea of saying you start with quiet, because I think a lot of us probably have things that we could remember or that we would remember if we actually thought about it.
Yeah.
How do you, I'm sure we have some parents who listen to our show. How do parents transmit some of these practices in ways that are sustainable and that, their kids might be receptive to? Do you think that this is an important part of parenting, is kind of passing on self-care practices?
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think that's how some people are starting to kind of piece things together, because again, in that quiet time, some of us have better childhood memories than others. So some folks, if you, were raised with your family of origin for cultural stuff anyways, you might start to remember things like, oh, wait, I remember my grandmother used to do this when I got sick. Or I remember, my great aunt, humming and rocking, which is sound healing, those different things. So in terms of children, they're curious, and it's great to start getting them involved in it as a family activity and making that time and space to explore the practices that are available. And especially when you talk about things that involve music and dancing. And it's interesting that you brought up kids, because that was one of the things I was thinking about, is that, a lot of times people will be like, I don't know, what's in my background or what I used to do. And sometimes it's people having children that make them get more into it, because your kid will be, you're playing Kids Bop or something, and your child's dancing and they're doing traditional dances of a culture that's part of your heritage, and they just know it because they don't have a bunch of other stuff that's clouded up there yet, right? So they're just moving to a certain way. A friend of mine was just showing me a video of their daughter, and they're just like, I didn't teach her that. She's dancing and she's doing Afro-Cuban dances when she was 4.
Yeah.
And when you look at that, you could look at that side by side and be like, this is this ritualistic dance that we do at this time. They know it. And so sometimes, to be honest, instead of us teaching them, they teach us, not knowing.
Yeah.
Often children are a conduit for that sort of thing.
I think that's so true, and kids are also, I think, much less self-censoring about what they need. So
Yes.
Kids will be like, I need quiet, right?
Yep.
They're very they're actually better almost at demanding what they need to kind of feel okay in a way that can be instructive. I also have found it amusing. I was having a conversation about self-care with a friend, and she was like, I don't know and I'd have time to do this. And I was like, I mean, you guys can do it together. And she's like, that's right. And then a few months later, she hit me up and was like, you know what? In my house now we all meditate because if like, because you know what? Like if they're not meditating, I'm not meditating. So my kid's not meditating, mommy's not meditating, and we all need to do this.
Everybody gonna meditate together.
Yes, because that's the way it gets. That's the way the time for it exists. And she says it's like really remarkable as her young kids, especially the boys, started meditating. She said she saw a real difference.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, a lot of schools are starting to integrate it as well.
And I wonder, you know, how people emotionally, I think it's not just about kind of losing your history through the process and erasure that happened through enslavement, but also there's trauma. There's trauma that gets passed down that makes, I would imagine, self-care uniquely challenging.
Yeah, I definitely believe that is an additional layer for descendants of African slaves here in the U.S. that we're in a different context. And so our experience is really unique. And through doing this work, we're really reaching back to a connection of, you know, reclamation to a space that isn't clean necessarily in terms of how we go about that process. And I totally have to give my wife like props for that thought piece, because we're discussing, you know, I was like, how do I articulate this piece? And here's this thought I have. And she was like, we're reclaiming and it's going to be messy. So, you know, really understanding that, you know, whatever practices or rituals give you a sense of connectiveness to the Afro-diasporic spirituality or healing process, you know, practices, that we're going to do it in a context that works for us, and recognizing that uniqueness, and just knowing that there's certain things that we're drawn to. But because of that history, a lot of us are doing some emotional labor around that. We're doing it with ourselves. There's the emotional labor of doing it with our families. Some of us feel like we're carrying, and this is also with women a lot of times, carrying the grief of generations of other women in our families. Sometimes carrying the grief of our mothers that weren't able to express the things that happened to them. And sometimes folks, you know, not even able to separate that some of the grief that they're having, and they might be like, am I depressed? What's going on? And it might clinically look like that, but a lot of what they're carrying isn't technically theirs. It's theirs in the sense of, yes, it's in their body. There's the cellular memory, but it's not theirs in the sense of the experience that happened to them. And how do you sift through that?
Yeah. You know, what's really interesting about everything you just said, which was very specific to a specific group of people in America who've had a specific experience. And I don't mean to kind of undermine the uniqueness of that experience in any way, but I could imagine a lot of people would listen to what you just said about feeling disconnected, guilt, carrying pain of those who came before you, trying to find your way to self-love. And people from all backgrounds, I think, could relate to some of these ideas, even if their experiences are really different.
Because that's common. I think that's a common thing for folks, because again, for, you know, the society in which we live in, but also the history of colonization isn't unique to the African diaspora. A lot of people gave up a lot of things.
Yeah. And I'm, again, not trying to kind of make experiences analogous or the same in any way, because they are very different experiences. But it's interesting to me that we often feel as a nation, as a people, as Americans, feel so divided. But I think if you were to tell the story of what it feels like to try to find self-care as an African American person who is descended from slaves, and you were to talk about the emotions and the feeling and the process, I'm not sure that. I think that a lot of people could relate to that. And it makes me wonder, like, why are we so divided? This shit is hard for everyone for very different reasons, from very different places. But it's like, there are these really common human emotions and challenges that we all face.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of it. If we're busy not recognizing some of that commonality in some of those places of intersection, then some of that work, you know, won't be done, but the systems that benefit off of us not doing that work keep moving. It keeps rolling.
It's just like we're busy fighting each other instead of healing each other so much of the time.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of, you know, why I feel like you have to start some of that healing then with yourself.
So how does resiliency factor into all of this?
It's a good question. Resiliency to me falls into this and factors into this in a way of really just recognizing I want to talk about resiliency from a different prospect, really. But talking about resiliency in regards to being able to kind of emotionally balance after being thrown into something that emotionally upsets us. So in the short term, it's a psychological term that's basically affect regulation is what it's referred to. And so basically, being able to bounce back and balance yourself and kind of regulate after something like that happens. But then we also talk about, which most people are familiar with because we use this for children, is self-soothing, right? Is that when something happens that offsets that emotional balance and you're able to kind of, regulate and rebalance yourself without outside help, self-soothing. And so in babies, we're like, that's amazing. We're going to just let them self-soothe themselves, cry themselves to sleep, do this thing. I think that in regards to the resiliency piece, we really need to think about resiliency in the context and the group of people in which we're talking about when we talk about resilience. And as folks of color in particular, that word can have a really negative connotation for some folks because often it is used to justify repeated abuse, repeated transgressions, because it's like they'll be fine. They're resilient. Black women are resilient. Black children are resilient. These people, I'm air quoting and no one can see it, they'll bounce back from this. And so how do we redefine, resiliency for ourselves? And so a lot of people that feel okay with reclaiming the word, think about it from the context of, being able to emotionally balance and bounce back in a way that they can be there for themselves, for their family, for their people, for their squad, and do the work together and really being able to thrive.
I think it breaks apart two things, which is that resiliency is not about just large, huge events of trauma, but it's about like the day-to-day of moving through the world. And then the second piece is that, but resiliency should not become an excuse for treating each other better.
Yeah.
Or for not having to treat someone well, I suppose,
not having to treat somebody well or to layer. It shouldn't be an excuse to keep layering things on people because they've dealt with hard things in the past. They can just keep taking, thing after thing.
I think, too, some of self-care for me, at least, has been about how to care for myself as I am trying to disrupt the way I've thought about things, because a lot of the stuff we're talking about is really about questioning and radically shifting the way you move through the world, which is hard and painful and sucks. And so self-care is also about like being able to do that without wanting to crawl up into a ball and die.
Yeah. I think a big piece about that is, again, a big part of self-care, which is an ongoing process, is about giving yourself permission for space. For many folks, due to, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, you name it, for various reasons, right? We, in our society, within our family, have places where we don't have space, right? We compact ourselves. We make ourselves small. And a big piece of self-care is about making yourself wide. And when I was doing work with trans women of color, and specifically Black trans women, that was one of the biggest things when we were talking as a group about like what they felt like they needed. And they were like, permission to be wide, like to take up space, to not make yourself small. And a lot of us, for various reasons, feel like or forced to, it's not all in our heads either, to do that. And so that's why when you start making that shift to embrace wellness and to start ritualizing it, so making time for meditation, making time for seeking out spiritual and cultural practices that fill your soul, that nourish you, that's why the guilt and the shame and some of those other things come up, because a lot of us haven't had space or spaces where we're able to be wide and breathe a full breath. Most people don't breathe full breaths. I work with clients and you have to ask them to breathe into certain parts of their bodies, and do diaphragmatic breathing and things like that, because we're not used to that. So we don't even give ourselves space within our own body, within our own rib cage. Our rib cages can expand a certain amount. We don't even allow it to do that.
One of the biggest lessons I learned over the last year and a half was not to also cede space. I think when you're used to having people take space or not allow you space, you sometimes stop taking it yourself because you're like, it's preemptive almost.
For myself, as a genderqueer person of color, that's daily, is people dirty looks on the train, even in a city that's as diverse as New York, just upset that you're doing what you need to do to live your life. And a lot of people give you unsolicited advice about how short my hair is, unsolicited advice about the way you dress, or just they do it through their body languages as well. You're like, I didn't ask for any commentary on the way that I live my life or carry myself.
And what's interesting, not interesting, but what's crazy about this is when we say this, everyone's like, yeah, I guess. Or people are like, I mean, that's rude. People are just trying to help. And I'm like, yeah, but like, I don't go up to white men and I'm like, I mean, I don't know. Like, do you really want to be wearing a polo right now? That seems like a lot. Like, I wouldn't, like, it would seem so absurd to think about doing it in the reverse. I know you have a way that you think about ritualizing self-care, which is what all of season 2 of the podcast is about. Can you tell me how you advise others to ritualize self-care? Because for me, this is like my big challenge and struggle of like, great, I found yoga, I found my Fitness Pal app, I figured out I like to take a walk and go outside, but how do I actually do those things every day?
Yeah, so the big piece is already looking at how you spend your time. It doesn't have to be as aggressive as, doing a time audit. Some people, if they're type A, then they might go ahead and do a time audit.
What is a time audit? I am fully type A.
A time audit is when you actually start you track your time. Huh. Some people do it as much as just tracking chunks of time. Some people do it down to the hour or down to the 15-minute increments. So you can, there's time tracking software, there's apps, there's, just charts about it. So some people do that first to even just get an idea of like, how am I spending my time? And am I spending my time to the extent that you have the privilege to? Because a lot of people don't have privilege to decide, 90% of their time or a certain percentage of their time. But for those that do, are you spending your time in ways that fulfill you? And that fulfillment, if you don't feel like you have that privilege, the fulfillment does still include, like, one of the things as part of my self-care is having, a place to sleep and food to eat. So if work's part of it, then work's part of it. But how do you spend your day? And then looking at are there places where you can add the activities or things in, or how do you add ritual into activities that you may already do in the, that you do as you go throughout your day. And sometimes adding things in that could be as short as a minute, 30 seconds. So if you have a certain way that you go to work and you have a staff meeting every week, then is it adding a 1 or 2 minute break where you stop right before the meeting? You set an extra alarm or extra reminder, and you just do some breathing exercises, because that your meeting that's coming up is sometimes stressful, or especially if for sure there's something stressful coming up, then you're giving yourself that time, and that might be your new ritual. For people like myself, where you work with a lot of different people, you're a healthcare provider, a body worker, energy work, you're an organizer. Is there something that you need to do at the end of your work day to kind of just separate yourself from work for that transition? So do you have a commuting ritual? So if you take the train, is there something that you can do on your way home that signals to you, your mind, and to your body that work is done? I'm done working. Mm-hmm. So is that, instead of listening to music, is that reading? Is that using an essential oil so that you literally are creating a scent memory that, at 5 o'clock, at 6, 7, whatever time you get off, that, there's an oil that you feel drawn to that's your favorite. You put a dab of it on a tissue, whiff it in front of your nose. Or if it's one that can be on the skin, some of them can't be directly on the skin. But if it's one that can, is it that you put a drop on your wrist? And then,
I'm definitely going to try doing that. That's my new thing. I'm going to try doing
Yeah. For me, I have certain shoes, when I work with clients, I have heavy client days. There's certain shoes that I have shoes that I wear that are just for work. So then when I transition, literally the way I move about the earth, I feel different because I'm not wearing my same shoes for their work shoes. What are those things? Is it just using what you work with your hands? You're a barber, you're a beautician, a butcher, whatever. Do you go into the restroom at work and just run cold water as hydrotherapy for your hands? That doesn't mean you have to go to a spa for a paraffin dip, but even just running your hands under cold water for, we want to conserve water. So it doesn't have to even be for a long time, but but you get the benefit of the cool water on the hands, so on the muscles, but then also the sensory piece of like, oh, I'm transitioning and it's the end of the day. So we always wash our hands with warm water. At the end of that, then just do a splash of cold. That's that transition and literally an awakening to the transition to the next part of your day.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that it is about signaling to yourself to create mental transitions, because I think what a lot of us struggle with, I can say for myself personally, is that it's not about identifying the habit, but it's like I have a hard time like what you're saying exactly, to stop working at a certain time and to shift gears. Shifting gears is challenging. So even if you have the hour blocked off in your schedule to go to the gym, to go for a walk, like you may have the time, but that mental shift is challenging. And it's very interesting, this idea of creating cues, whether it's through water, clothes, shoes, smell, but it's like it's creating a sensory cue that it's time to shift.
Yes. And that's the piece that's huge in it. I think it's easier to then ritualize it, because for some folks, depending on what that sensory cue is, your body will start to crave it. It'll be like, wait a minute, we didn't do this thing yet. And then also at different points in our journey, some things that worked really well for us may not.
Yes.
You know, for some people may really be jamming out on guided meditation, and then something in particular is going on with their lives, and it's really hard for them to sit still and do it at this point. So maybe then they need to do something that's a movement based, which still can have a meditative quality to it, but they need to get that anxiety out first. So then maybe they're switching to Qigong or Tai Chi or something like that. And that's what's resonating with them better and vibing with them better at that point. And so those are the things. But when you're looking at how you're spending your time, you might be able to look at what are some things you can swap out, or what are some things that you can decrease. And then the other big piece too is that for the self-care and the wellness, it doesn't also have to be this big shift, even of adding in things like meditation and yoga. It could be just also recognizing that just doing what you need to do to get through the day is part of your self-care and your wellness. But maybe even then just doing that either with more ease or with more finesse. So does that mean that, you're somebody, you work 2-3 jobs and you're a student and a parent? Then that might mean I can't add in meditation, but you know what I can do? I can dance while I brush my teeth so I get some movement in the morning. So if I can, I'm going to listen to some music on my phone in the morning. It puts me in a good mood that makes me happy. So there's certain things that you can combine activities. You still can be mindful, but like I tell my massage students, I teach massage, and a lot of it's leg work. And I'm like, hey, when you're brushing your teeth in the morning, do it in a squat position. Do it in a lunge position, so you're getting your body used to moving that way. And then it doesn't feel like a chore, like, oh, I got to go do squats now because you're already brushing your teeth anyways. So just also too thinking about how do you integrate some stuff as well and weave it in.
Yeah, totally. So thank you so much for joining us, Carla. This was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot and will be definitely taking a lot of your advice to heart. And I would like to thank our listeners for listening to another episode of Self-Care Sundays. Before we wrap up here, I want to offer a special shout out to our patrons on Patreon. Their generosity makes our show possible and are a huge reason why you're hearing this episode today. We are especially grateful for the support of our super contributors, Vicky B, Rainu J, Brady K, Bill S, and Embershot. If you'd like to support the show and hear your name at the end of our episodes, please check out patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Again, that's patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Also give us a follow on Twitter at Self-Care Sundays and on Facebook at Self-Care Sundays. Carla, thank you again for joining us for the second time on Self-Care Sundays. I encourage all listeners to check out episode 117 of Self-Care Sundays with Carla from last year, everywhere Self-Care Sundays is streaming. Carla, where can our audience find you on social media?
So I'm at Rooted Bodywork, ROOTED Bodywork on Facebook, Instagram. I'm not a big Twitter person, but I'm also on Twitter. And then also my website is rootedbodywork.com.
Great. I'd like to thank the person who made our show art, Leo Horowitz, and the amazing artists who make our show music, For Real City. On behalf of our producer, Jess Talwar, our communications interns, Kennedy Freeman and Sophie Gomez, our audio engineer, Kato Zane, and myself, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Self-Care Sundays podcast. We'll see you on our next episode.